You got this, learning to lead in crisis. We're delighted to have you here. If you weren't here for either or both of the last two sessions, just know that those are recorded and are available to you. We do build on the sessions, so after each session, we continue to work with the learning and also recognizing that this is a fluid time to be a leader as the crisis evolves, unfolds, morphs into something new. So we're pivoting where we need to with the content and the material that we're presenting with you. But this session is on conflict and resiliency. We're going to do a little bit of a recap on what we covered in the previous two sessions in just a moment. But before we do that, we just want to acknowledge who we are as we lead the session. So my name is Danny Ceballos, and I'm the president of Unleashed Consulting. At Unleashed Consulting, we're building better bosses. So we concentrate on the supervision relationship in organizations, primarily nonprofit and healthcare organizations, working with middle, senior, and executive leaders. And Christina, would you mind introducing yourself?
Sure, I'm Christina Rowe, and my work really focuses on building collaborative leaders and teams, and building and developing welcoming organizations from their structure through their culture.
Great.
And I'm Lisa Stokes from Kavi Consulting Services. My background that I bring to this session is primarily in working with organizations through crisis. I've worked with a couple of dozen organizations through different crises, and was the person at the National Office of Planned Parenthood who organized Planned Parenthood's response to Hurricane Katrina, which included a number of things, including having a tent clinic on the coast. And so that's sort of the background I bring to this. I'm also the person sort of behind the scenes dealing with a lot of the registration and getting people links and all that kind of thing. So if anybody's having problems with that, I know that there are some kinks in the system. Feel free to email me. Our contact information is at the end of the slide deck. You'll be getting a follow-up from me. So just feel free to contact me directly about that. So back to you, Danny.
Great, thanks, Lisa. So what we're going to be doing now is doing a little bit of a check-in here with you all, and then we'll go into some content. We have some great things to share with you, some great tools, and then we'll spend the last third or so on doing some group coaching, some laser-focused mastermind coaching. So we'd like to start off by getting your voice in the room, so to speak. So we're going to ask you a couple of poll questions, and you'll see that appearing there right in front of your eyes right now. The first question is, what is the level of conflict you are seeing in your interactions with people this week? And if you can think of the scale as 1 as not at all, and 5 as a hell of a lot, that would be great. So the same with number 2, question 2, has this increased over the past few weeks? And then number 3, how well equipped do you feel to address this conflict productively? So again, answer those 3 questions for us, if you will. 1 is not at all, and 5 is a lot. And then 2, 3, and 4 are gradations of that. And we'll give you just a minute to do that. And if you've never used the polling function, 1 is very little, right? So Elizabeth, you're asking, is 1 decrease? So in general, first question is very little. Number 2 is no, it hasn't very much. Question number 2. And then question number 3, scale 1 would be how well equipped, not well equipped at all. So if you've never used the polling function, you're welcome. If you've never used the polling function, know that it's a really really nice gift that, that Zoom builds into its platform, a way of getting some audience involvement and interaction. And so I think, Christina, you're monitoring this, and you just let us know.
Yeah, and we'll give about 10 more seconds. So if anyone wants to go ahead and submit their answer, we'll give you about 10 more seconds, and then we'll end the poll.
And the great thing about this poll is we'll be able to call the results really quickly and shoot them right back to you. So we get to see who's in the room. The wisdom is in the room, and we'll get to see where we are in levels of that wisdom and insight.
Yeah, okay, ending the poll.
And the poll is ended, folks. And here we go. So there we go. Yeah. So what is the level of conflict you are seeing in your interactions with people this week? 1 was not at all, 5 was a lot, and it looks like we're seeing not so much. Okay, so number 2, so not as bad as 3, 4, and 5. Has this increased over the past few weeks? 1 is not at all, 5 is a lot, and we see that it hasn't. Most folks said that it hasn't increased all that much more. However, we got a whole bunch of folks that are also saying number 3, that it has increased.
Yeah.
And then the third question, how well equipped do you feel to address this conflict productively? And 1, not at all, 5, very much so. And it looks like when we kind of add up 3, 2, and 1, we get what, 30, 66. About 80% of us are feeling like we could really use some help in this. Lisa, was there something else that you were thinking?
Nope, not at all.
Right on. So I think we're well poised. Christina, anything? You jump in, right? Okay.
No, I think that's probably par for the course, and that we're going to see some of these possibly conflicts arise a little more as kind of compassion fatigue increases, or as people start to get uncomfortable with some of the states, depending on where people are going back into offices or things like that. And we'll probably see another anxiety spike. So it's good to see that this is kind of a little bit of a lull where maybe a lot of people can be learning the conflict tools so that they're prepared going into any kind of spike. That's right. Yeah. The better prepared we are right now, the better we'll be able to weather the next dip in the change curve that we spoke of and we'll speak of again. Great. So thanks so much, everybody, for jumping in on that. Good to know who's in the room and where we are with our appetite for new tools and new ways of learning to lead through crisis. So I want to do a quick recap on what we covered over the past few weeks. So the first is that we stress over and over again the importance of the first job of a leader is to define reality, is to be clear with what we know, what we don't know, not necessarily what the solutions are, but to give folks what they need to thoroughly understand the present situation. And you'll see in parentheses on the slide, it says we need to do that again and again. So every time that you or your folks are interacting with folks that are following you or that you're leading, your organization, your team, your people, you want to start off those interactions with, this is what we know today. This is what we know today versus what we know yesterday. You'll see that some of our better political leaders, our more political leaders, our governors, and some other folks are actually doing a pretty good job of that. And when they don't do a good job of that is when people start to make up things, right? We start filling in the gaps. Number 2 in the recap is that we stress the importance of, after you've defined reality, is what will you do to create safety, predictability, and control, right? It doesn't have to be perfect, but what are your attempts? What is your strategy? What are your messages for creating safety, predictability, and control? We know this is part of the human condition, that when our ground is not firm and we're not able to hang on to things, that's when we really want to hang on to something. So whatever you can do as a leader to give something where folks can feel tethered, feel like they can predict something, that they are safe, you are doing yourself a lot of service as a leader. It's a really good way to approach this. The third point was, we talked last week about compassion and the importance of compassion and how too much compassion over an extended period of time lends itself to compassion fatigue. But we know that compassion is not only important for ourselves, but it's important for the folks that we lead. It is the cornerstone of resiliency in getting through crisis. So take stock of your own compassion for yourself. We know that folks that are more compassionate towards themselves are more compassionate towards others. And so take stock in terms of your level of your compassion for yourself and see if you can up that by 10, 20%, and so that you can actually be more compassionate with the folks that you are leading. And number 4, we talked about emotions like anger, frustration, fear. All of those emotions actually are reflections of unmet needs. So the more detective work we can do as a leader to actually uncover, peel back the layers of the emotion and get to what the unmet need is, the more effective we can be in leading folks, because we can do a lot with unmet needs. We can't always do a lot with emotions, not in the same strategic, effective way. So we're going to continue in that practical sense of what do we do now as we're leading folks through crisis. We'll continue in that vein, and today we're going to be talking about some more tools and other musts for getting people to be more resilient and to be able to weather this storm.
So we wanted to just real quickly cover the group guidelines that you've heard me speak of the past couple of weeks, but we're going to ask that you, again, just absorb these and take these into account as we go through the rest of our hour together. So the first is confidentiality. We ask that you respect that anything that is said here that is specific to a name, a place, an event for a colleague in this room, in this virtual room, that you do not bring that outside of this room. That said, the things that you learn here, the general lessons, the tools, the themes, feel free, and we encourage you to bring that out. The whole point of this work, of this series of trainings, is to equip you so that you can better equip others. So in that way, we're doing our own kind of viral push out there. We hope that that the things that we're sharing with you, because they are simple, they're strategic, we know that they work. We really want you to bring those out to your colleagues and your organizations. Number two is API. API stands for Assume Positive Intent, recognizing that whatever's said in this room, whether it's from us as the presenters or from each other, it is coming from a good place. We are all in this together in more ways than just a bumper sticker. Number three is adapt, not adopt, meaning we hope that you'll take what we offer here and make sense of it for yourself. It's not beneficial to think that everything is 110% perfect for you that we present to you. We prefer that you think of this as a delightful smorgasbord that you can pick and choose the lobster tail that you want, but maybe keep the green bean casserole off to the side. So whatever you need to take in and to work with is what we encourage you to take with you from this session. Number four, acknowledging that the wisdom is in the room. Lisa and Christina and I have lots to say, probably too much sometimes, but we want to hear from you too. We want to hear from you in the chat box. We want to hear from you when we ask you to take yourself off mute. We recognize that in a lot of ways, this is just one way training and education and support, but as much as possible, we want to make it a two-way and recognize that there is so much that we can teach each other and the wisdom is in the room. And then number five, again, encouraging you to step in and step up. I know it's super easy to be behind your screen and to just take it all in, but with as much as possible, we would love to hear from you. So jump into the chat box. Christina will be monitoring that. If something needs to be said, we may ask you to take yourself off mute and fully explain that a bit more. And also when we go, we're going to go into our masterminding, our laser focused coaching later on. And so we're going to need a volunteer from you. We're hoping that one of you will take into account what we're talking about today. And if you have any challenges in applying any of the tools that we're going, or insights that we're talking about today, please step in and say that you would like to get some support and help on that. Just put it in the chat box. We're looking for one, maybe two, but probably just one volunteer that will sit in what we're going to call the heart seat, right? And be able to take in some really good strategic laser focused coaching and support from all of us in this room. So again, consider yourself right now if you would be willing to volunteer and be a part of that process, and just throw it in the chat box now or as we go through the next few minutes.
Okay, great. And speaking of the chat box, I'm going to ask you all to chat. So most of you who, in any way, anybody who's been on this in these sessions in the past and has seen this crisis curve, we're going to ask you to jump in and type in the chat box where you think you are today in the crisis curve. And Christina's going to watch that and sort of give us a sense of what that read is. But we're going to give about 30 seconds or so for people to type real quickly where they think they are in the crisis curve. And I know it's hard for people to concentrate while I talk, so I'm going to be silent until we see a few more answers, and then I'll start talking about what each of these mean.
We're seeing a lot of people say that they're in the reconciliation area and hopefully moving into the reconstruction. Quite a few saying they kind of feel like they're merging out of the depression area of the curve. And some saying they're really sitting somewhere in the bottom of the curve at the moment. It feels like between depression and reconciliation. Those are the most common one kind of, and there's a few saying, you know, they feel like they're coming out of the emerging reality into the depression piece.
Sure. And so the reason why is If this were a curve that only happened once, you know, it would be complicated enough, but here's what's happening. So the first wave of sort of crisis was us in the United States coming to understand COVID's real. We have to make drastic changes in our life. Here's the drastic changes. And then trying to figure out how to make everything else work around shelter in place and what that meant for taking care of our kids and our jobs and the economy. And sort of, we all got settled. That was the acute phase where we came to understand that. And then emerging reality is how we sort of pivoted to make that happen. After this went on for a while and people began to understand it wasn't going to go right away, people started, for the most part, sliding into that depressive part of the curve where you might see people lashing out, becoming impatient. And interestingly enough, some of the behavior we've seen in the headlines, whether it's people shooting people who are making too much noise, increase in domestic abuse, or even more ordinary things like the protests that have been going on. All of that is very characteristic of that stage. And you would expect for Americans on the whole, given when COVID became an issue, to be about there or emerging from there into reconciliation. And reconciliation means we're coming to understand that the world isn't going to be the same as it was pre-COVID. We're not quite sure what that looks like, but we're sort of grieving and letting go and looking forward and trying to figure out what that means. The interesting thing is now that we're moving towards coming out of shelter in place and different states are starting to talk about opening up public space and what that means, we're doing two things simultaneously in this curve. We are moving towards reconstruction, but we're also starting the curve again, right? So what does that mean? What does that mean in terms of my childcare, how I work? Employers are saying you can go back to work, but schools aren't open yet. How do I make that work? All those things. So we're starting that whole loop again. And so that explains why people are seeing themselves in different places in this curve. All of which is to say, the curve is not stagnant. You will move in and out, depending on what's happening. And then also, though, talking about the importance of, and we'll talk about this at the end of this process or at the end of this session, but all of that is also to say, as soon as there's a reset, we move into a new phase, that work of a leader to define reality and then help people identify how to create safety, predictability, and control that makes their jobs manageable starts all over again. And every time there's a pivot, you have to do that again as a leader. But we're going to move on today to talk a little bit about conflict. And the reason we're doing this as two reasons. One, as I said, where we have been in the curve is when you typically see an increase in conflict. But number two, as we move into reconciliation and people start to understand sort of the long-term consequences on the economy, on public health, et cetera, you're going to see an increase in conflict. People are going to feel more pressed. And so it's really important to sort of tune up our skills and make sure we have skills for moving ahead. And sort of the way we talk about this with people is, sort of there's a level reset, a sort of a reset when we start this work. We encourage people to move away from the idea that somebody in a conflict is right or wrong, and to move away from really clinging to the idea that I'm right or wrong, and instead really focus on using conflict as an opportunity to make sure that people are seen, heard, and valued. And that's because if people are seen, heard, and valued, they're much more likely to participate in problem solving, even if the people who are on conflict can't meet each other's needs or each other's requests. If they're seen, heard, and valued, they're much more likely to participate in creative problem solving and joint problem solving. And so the way we talk about this is level set, not right or wrong, focus on seen, heard, and valued, and then move into really identifying solutions. And so the way we've found that when people work through conflict or engaged in conflict in the work or in their personal life, it feels really unmanageable, especially those hard conversations that maybe you bump up against time and time again, and it just feels like, gosh, we never make any progress. And so what we've done is try to give people 5 different tools to use in their toolkit. You can use all of them, or you can use just one, depending on what's going on, but tools for your toolkit that you can try in circumstances and see what really works. And we don't encourage you to try the hardest conflict in your life with a new tool. Start out easy with something that's a little bit more manageable. But I'm just going to give a brief overview real quickly about what these are. So tool number 1 is really clarifying, what's going on here? What are we actually talking about? And what are the facts and what are perceptions? So when you have a conversation with somebody and they say something like, you always, that's a perception, not a fact. Or when they use inflammatory words, words that can't be quantified, those are perceptions and not facts. And so the first step is always to step back and say, what's really happening here, and use terms that are easily quantifiable. The way I always think about it is, if I were a scientist in a lab, how would I log this in a log sheet? You know, what happened? What day did it happen? Who did what? What could be seen? What could be measured? Start out there. And often you find that just that step about clarifying what the argument is about does one of two things. Either you identify that you're not even having the same argument, or B, it helps you set aside the perceptions and deal with just the facts, and helps everybody sort of cool down. The second step we talk about, or the second sort of tool in your toolbox, is identifying needs. And last week we talked about unmet needs being something that often results in anger, right? And so we have a little bit of a pre-read, or some pre-work on this one. But we're going to swing back to talking a little bit more about that today too. But identifying those underlying needs, because what happens is people often argue over the strategies for solving a problem rather than talking about the actual need itself. And when you get down to the actual need that's underlying the strategies, often there are several more solutions available to you if you get down to that need level rather than focusing on the strategy. The third tool is something we call bridging, which is really just making sure that people are seen, heard, and valued. And as I said, you don't have to agree with what people are asking. You don't have to give them what they're asking. You may not be able to meet their request. But focusing on making sure you're actually hearing what that person is asking for and expressing that you heard it and that you value their opinion, whether you agree with it or not, or whether you can fulfill it or not, is an incredibly important part of building relationships and getting somebody involved in problem solving jointly with you rather than being on opposite sides of problem solving. The fourth tool is request. And we all know that one. The request we know is jumping to solutions and asking for the solution that we would like, right? But there's other requests. There's requests asking for time, asking for more information, asking for an opportunity to come back and reconvene when people have cooled down. Lots of requests you could make when you're involved in a conversation that feels heated or feels stuck. And then the final step, and this is something that we all sort of take for granted, but don't necessarily do, is just confirming the solutions together. You know, what did we agree to? Who's going to do what? And setting a check-in time for actually following up to see how it's going. And it's that check-in time to see how it's going that people often forget. And we sort of slide back into our old behavior, especially when we're under duress. And in crisis, you're going to see people slide back into old behavior and sort of forget newer agreements much more commonly.
That's great. Thank you, Lisa. I want to take a minute for everyone to reflect on the tools that Lisa just described at kind of a very high level and think about, did any of those jump out at you? Can you think of one of those easier, maybe more approachable places of friction or conflict that one of these could be applied to? If you take a moment and use this as an opportunity to write in the chat box, which tool could you put to good use right now? Maybe the confirming the solutions together because you've been problem solving together and you need to circle back. I'll give you about a minute to pick one and submit it in the chat box. Wonderful. Keep sharing if you haven't shared yet. But I wanted to share that we're seeing a ton talking about bridging right now, making sure that people are seen, heard, and valued. Because not only is it one of the things that's the most on the surface for a lot of us, it's also very high importance to people at the moment. And we're also seeing a lot of identifying needs. If we can get in there and identify a need for any one person, or the different individuals on our team, what's being unmet, it really gives us the opportunity to proactively start helping to meet that need. And I do say helping, not that it's your responsibility as a leader to fully fill somebody else's need. We won't be able to fully meet them for the most part, but we can contribute to adding to that need being met along the way. That's great. And does anybody want to volunteer a situation where they're going to try applying it? If you want to come off mute or share it in the chat real quick.
Hey, Christina, I'm going to share an example actually. I was hiking this weekend and there was a woman walking opposite of me who instantly went off into a rant because I wasn't wearing a mask, and I was more than 6 feet away from her. But she clearly felt unsafe in that situation, right? And so there's a couple choices I could have had in that situation, one of which would have been to sort of mirror back what she was directing at me, which was tempting in that circumstance. But the other one would be to identify sort of what her underlying need was. She talked to me about I should be doing this, I should be doing that, but clearly her need was safety and to make sure she wasn't exposed to the virus by me, right? And so it could have been addressed any number of ways, including walking the opposite way on the trail or giving her more space or something like that. It's a really simple example, and it didn't involve a lot of conversation. I didn't have to ask her what her needs were. I actually had to just think about what she was saying and react.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I love that example because it also is a good example of being careful not to put the right or wrong, right? Mm-hmm. Which I imagine was a bite your tongue moment in some ways, right? Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Take some discipline on our own to engage with these tools.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's a great example, and really leads into the idea of clarifying, right? That we often can jump to those conclusions. We can kind of take the chance to put a right or a wrong into the situation before we've actually taken the time to confirm what it is that that person is really looking for. Mm-hmm. And so that's where we have this chance to really walk through situation. This is the situation, how I see it. This is the behavior that I understood or that I was able to witness, and this is the impact that it had on me. Is that what was intended, or is that what you were looking for? A lot of times we want to really be focused on just the observable data. Mm-hmm. The fact of this was the knowns in the situation. This was the behavior that was visible. Not the intended behavior, but the visible behavior. And then this is the impact. This is the very clear impact that happened from it. A lot of times when we're looking at this one, it's another way other than the kind of scientist in a lab, which is a good way to think about it. Another one is think of yourself as the documentarian in this moment. If you're the one sitting back observing the penguins, what did the penguins do? What was their situation? What was their behavior, right? Even put it into Morgan Freeman's voice in your head. Sometimes that helps bring down your own reactions a little bit. But taking that moment to really clarify what are the known facts and removing the language like you always do this behavior. You always make me wait till the end of the day to get my questions answered, or you never remember to circle back to me for my questions. Mm-hmm. So those kinds of places, when we're acting as if anyone's behavior is that consistent, we're putting ourselves into a place where we're making a judgment call. And like Danny brought up, it's not really useful to make a judgment call of right and wrong in this initial tool. What we want to be doing is creating the space for somebody else to react and share and clarify what their intentions were, or where they were coming from, or what made them feel the way to elicit that behavior. And you're creating that space with your own observations. Lisa or Danny, either of you have a good example that you want to share?
Do you want me to jump in, Danny?
Yeah, go right ahead. Yeah, I'm thinking.
Okay. So I was working with a team on a deadline, and We missed a critical element of the deadline because I didn't get the information I needed. It would have been, I was really frustrated, and it would have been very easy for me to really lambaste somebody in particular who hadn't got the information in. I didn't think that that was going to be particularly helpful for our working relationship. And so the example I used is I just restated sort of what the situation was. You know, we're applying for this grant. The behavior, you know, we're applying for this grant. We needed the information by such and such time. I didn't have the information, and therefore the impact was we didn't get the grant, period. No like accusations, no like you're failing us, nothing like that. The person who was on the other end of that was probably feeling sheepish already, and nailing them to a cross about it was not going to be helpful. Instead, having that conversation would open up a conversation for A, if they wanted to apologize or take responsibility, but B, also a conversation about what can we do about that now, which was really what was the important part, right? What can we do about that now, and how can we prevent this in the future? If this had been a conversation with somebody who that had happened repeatedly, that SBI, the situation behavior impact, would have been a little bit different, because I would have been talking about the number of things that had been missed, and I would have used language like, I want to give a few examples, give those examples, not say this has happened a number of times, you know, that kind of thing, the inflammatory language, but I would have given more examples to them. So it's a pretty common one that happens at a workplace, so that's why I share that.
Yeah, that's a great example. And if you listen to the way that Lisa set it up, it left space to learn, right? Mm-hmm. There were mistakes made, and those happen, and they're going to happen even more frequently when we're in crisis, because we can't take in the level of detail where the dates and timelines. How many of us are even having those moments where we're like, is today Tuesday? Right. I'm not sure, right? So dates and timelines and deadlines, they're not as fresh to our brain right now, because we have so many other things that it's trying to calculate, and while managing some of that kind of fight or flight response. But what Lisa did in that example of SBI is she left space for someone to learn. She left space for somebody to take ownership of what their role was in it, and then be able to move forward so that they knew how to prioritize it in the future when they needed to. Mm-hmm. And that's where the SBI can be such a huge tool, especially within crisis, is it's giving us a chance to start the movement towards improving the situations without it being a game of blame and defensiveness. And those are not useful tools. When we get our defenses up, we slow everything down a bit.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah, if I could jump into also, there's so I'm reflecting on some of from Elizabeth Jenkins Salin, who says, reminds me of the group agreement, assume positive intent and own the impact. And that's usually the corollary to assume positive intent, is own the impact. And it reminds me of another ground rule, if you will, for these kinds of using these tools. And that is to stay curious and be fascinated. This work is so much easier when we go into the place of what can I legitimately learn and be curious about in this situation? What more information and data do I need before I get to judgment and conclusion, which really shouldn't even be on your radar when you're in this place of just gathering information. So, and it makes the whole thing just a lot more enjoyable. And it reminds me of the fact that, again, we need to adapt these things to use the language that makes sense for us. I often encourage clients who are not comfortable with doing this to say, I'm not comfortable doing this, but this is what I need to do. And I'm putting on the hat that I need to, right? And I'm very curious and I want to. So folks know that you are both in a place that's new, but that will work. So, give yourself, do whatever you need to do to make this work. I think we get caught up in thinking, well, that's leadership speak, or that's OD speak, or psychobabble. And let's go down to what is the essential tool, the essential thing that we're sharing here, and then figure out how to make it work for yourself in the language that works for yourself.
Yeah. And I think the language that Danny is pointing out, some of the ones we wanted to share with you is what I heard you say is, and then the other one is, this is what it looked like to me. And the piece that I want you to take note of that is, you're leaving space for the other person to contribute in that. It's not, well, you said this. it's what I heard you say is this. And that's room for asking, did I hear you correctly?
Right.
Right? And this is what it looked like to me, leaves that space for, is that what you intended to come across? Or is that how it was meant? And it opens a very different conversation. And it even helps, that kind of language even helps to remind us to stay open, to be listening for the other pieces so that we're not taking the time building it up in our own heads or getting more emotional. The next piece is remember needs. We all have needs in the workplace, and we all have all those human needs outside of the workplace, which we're sometimes a little bit better about recognizing. But in the workplace, it's okay to have needs. We need to learn how to address them, talk about them, and also help proactively meet them for each other so that we're building up as steady a group as possible on our teams. And as leaders, you want to listen for those pieces of safety, right? Setting the reality helps to do that. Control, defining what you can have an impact on right now, what can be done, what can be proactive that's moving towards your goals or your outcomes that you're trying to achieve. Success like mastery is going to be one that maybe is feeling really out of hand for people that hasn't felt out of hand in a long time, because mastery can be getting to really know and be able to accomplish something very well. And you might have a lot of people on the teams that you're working with, or you yourself feeling like, I'm having all these new things asked of me at once, and I don't have the time and space to master them. And that, if that's a very high priority need for you, it can feel really out of sorts, or make you feel a little bit out of shifted. And then there's respect, like what are people contributing? What are they doing? Recognition, that ties to that seen and heard. How do you help people feel really recognized within this? How are you encouraging them from what their contributions are, and valued? That valued is, how do you make people feel like they're of worth within your team, that their work is really having those positive impacts? And then moving into balance, how do you make sure that people know that it's okay to walk away from the computer sometimes? Giving them some balance to be able to create focus on other things, on personal, asking them to contribute to, when should we be setting up meetings? Is there an afternoon nap for your kids that you have at home, that's the prime time to have an adult conversation? Because it's harder, first thing in the morning when all the kids are up, or when are your kids' lesson times, and is it easier to talk then? And then belonging and a sense of community. This one has been infringed upon a lot by the situations that we're in this crisis. And what we want to think about is, are there 15-minute last, coffees that you can have with people to talk about anything but work? Can you do that on a Zoom call so that you're connecting with them? Can you create those open door moments where you're able to invite people and say, hey, I'm going to hang out on Zoom for the next hour, pop in and let me know how you're doing with your team, so that you're able to have those conversations where they're able to really contribute and feel connected to you as a person, not just to the work.
Great. I'd like to, in this next slide, address a question that's come up that I think is really integral to the work. Ivy asked, how can I make people feel better when I'm not feeling so great myself? And the answer is really in this tool. And the reason we hit this so hard in a time of crisis is this is much more important to people in a time of crisis than not. It's because people's basic needs aren't being met, their need for mastery, their need to accomplish things, they don't feel seen, heard, or valued. It erodes their confidence, it erodes so many things that make their life work. And Danny hit on a point that fits here too earlier. He talked about compassion. So the point of using this tool is to really generate genuine compassion. One of the mistakes we make with people is that we focus on empathy and sort of crawling into the misery with people, instead of compassion, which is sort of holding space for people in the situation. And you can use this tool to hold space, to show to somebody, to demonstrate to somebody that they're seen, heard, and valued, without crawling into some of the misery with them, which is where our burnout comes from and why we're feeling miserable. So I want to, and actually there was another question that came up earlier about personal opinions versus professional ones. This is also a great way to step away from that. The truth is, when you're using the clarifying tool, for example, you know, whether it's your personal opinion or your professional opinion that you're advocating for, you're still advocating for an opinion. This tool helps you get away from that dynamic, and instead of advocating for your opinion, you're starting to focus on what's actually happening here and making sure that you're hearing the whole entire issue. And then you can go back to your opinion after that and talk about, well, this is how it looks through my eyes, or this is what I believe to be true. But taking that step back and verifying that you're actually hearing what's happening is a really important part of this. And so I'm gonna, rather than talk at you, I'm gonna have everybody do a little simulation to demonstrate the impact of this tool. So I'd like everybody to focus on a conversation they had, a hard conversation they had with somebody that didn't go so well. Let's say, you know, you're with a friend, a colleague, a boss, a partner, and it's a time in your life when maybe you weren't so proud of it, but you were really frustrated and you just sort of let it all out, just like lambasted that person. This is what happened, you know, just all the things that have been sort of welling up in you. And think about what that person's reaction was and sort of allow yourself to feel the tension of that moment. I'll give you about 10 seconds. And now I want you to think, what would that conversation have felt like for you if instead of however that person responded, they responded to you by saying, I think what I'm hearing you say is whatever. Did I get it right? How did that feel? How does that feel different? Anybody? Want to just put it in the chat box? Feels calming. You would have felt understood. Right? Generally, it sort of brings the tension down. You would have felt reassured, like they're listening. So let's go back to that simulation and try one more thing. So same thing. You just sort of let it all out. It's been bottled up for weeks or days or whatever. And instead that person turns to you and says, I'm wondering if you're feeling whatever, angry, frustrated, concerned, because you really need fill in the blank, whatever that need is. How would that have felt to you? Patronizing. Yep, we get that. Anybody else? I know the technology keeps us behind a little bit, so I'm gonna just jump in here. So some people say it feels patronizing, it feels condescending. And so this is the point at which we say use the tools that feel applicable. Sometimes it's really reassuring. Sometimes it feels patronizing. For some people though, this is extremely comforting. They feel very seen and heard. For some people, just verifying the understanding is enough. And the truth is, if this doesn't fit for your situation, don't do it. But if it seems like a good tool, we encourage you to use it. And to use it, I encourage you to test it out with people you know so that you can sort of get a good feel for it. In the interest of time, I'm just gonna sort of move to the next page or the next thing. Somebody did suggest though, you could start by saying, you know, I'm wondering if is a really good way to lead into this conversation too. So I know we wanna do a mastermind. So just real quickly, you know, next week we're gonna focus on resiliency. And though what we've been doing to this point, and here's sort of a newsflash, what we've been doing to this point is really talking about the foundation of resiliency, right? So talking about defining reality, creating safety, predictability, and control, addressing unmet needs, addressing conflict. All those things have to happen in order to really build resiliency in yourself and on your team. It's hard to move right into resiliency if some of that stuff is sort of lagging behind or nagging. It's almost like a Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And if people aren't feeling safe, if they're not feeling in control, they're not gonna be able to go that next step to build resiliency. So that's sort of like the framework. The other thing, as I mentioned before, really important to focus on compassion versus empathy. Leaders cannot build resilient teams if they're really focusing on empathy and in the suffering with people rather than holding space for them. That doesn't mean you don't identify you're suffering from the same things. It doesn't mean that you don't, you don't recognize those feelings. But there's a difference between being disempowered or holding space for people and really hearing them and letting them have that experience of being seen and heard and valued. So I know we want to focus on having some time for a mastermind. And so Danny, do you want to kick us off on that?
Already, yep. So we're going to go into a laser focused masterminding session. And Christina, we do have a volunteer, and that's Pamela Rich. So we'll be sure to take her off mute. And basically